Is a dogma lesson just not bothering to plan? That's a question for TEFLologists. When I read this book, is it better to skim or scan? That's a question for TEFLologists. Can you be a good teacher if you have a CELTA? Or should you invest in an MA or a Delta? From politics to methodology, we'll discuss them all on TEFLology.
Hello, I am Matthew.
I'm Rob.
And I'm Matt.
And welcome back to TEFLology, a podcast about teaching English as a foreign language and related matters, presented by three self-certified TEFLologists.
TEFL News.
Okay, we're going to start with TEFL News. This is actually connected to a news story we looked at back in episode 1 about a study at Edinburgh University showing that bilingualism had lots of positive effects on brains. So, right. So the new study, which has come out, is actually showing how these effects might be achieved. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
And also what happens to the brain when we learn new languages.
Okay.
So this is actually, it's a Swedish study using fMRI scanners of the brain on the effects of language learning. Yeah.
Right. Nice.
So what happened was they took young adult military recruits and had them learn different languages, presumably languages which they knew nothing about. So the languages they chose were Arabic, Russian, and Dari.
Right.
Which is a dialect of Persian.
Okay.
The dialect spoken in Afghanistan.
Right. That makes sense with the military connection.
Yeah, I guess so, yeah. So what they did is they also had a control group of the military recruits who studied other subjects, but not languages.
Right.
Basically. And then what they did is, I guess they scanned the brains at the beginning of the experiment and then at the end. Basically, the brains of the students who studied languages developed in size, and the control group's brains did not.
Okay. Developed physically in size.
Physically in size.
Wow.
Yeah.
By how much do we know?
Probably very, I don't know. I assume very small
there
amounts.
was an increase.
There was development.
Right.
Yeah. I mean, you think it wouldn't be like a 25% increase?
Yeah, no, it's still contained within the human skull.
Cranium.
Yes.
Right.
So the growth was I think they talk about the hippocampus and the areas of the cerebral cortex traditionally related to language learning.
Right.
I don't know. My understanding is they have some idea about that, but they're not 100% sure.
Yeah.
I've heard reports of them seeing like first language in one area, second language in another, and then even like third language in other parts of the brain. But
Oh, really? The third language goes somewhere else.
right, yeah, that's what I've heard.
Interesting.
But I guess they have some idea.
What about people who are born like completely bilingual, or not born, but raised completely bilingual? Do they just have both languages crammed into one bit of the brain?
I assume so, yeah.
Yeah.
Because they're both first languages. They're not.
But they're both learnt on the same terms, so I guess they'd be in the same place.
You'd think so, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Well, let's Google it afterwards. Thorough research on this podcast.
Right. Okay, so another maybe important thing is the students whose brains which showed growth had better language skills than the other learners for whom the motor region of the cerebral cortex developed more.
Right.
Does that make sense?
Yeah. So you mean like the ones who were studying other skills or other subjects?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So maybe different areas of the brain developed different depending on what they were studying. If they were studying a language, then one part developed in one way, and if they were studying a different subject or a skill, then another part of the brain developed a bit more. Is that what it's saying?
I think so. Yes.
Right.
Yeah. So the implications of this are perhaps clear. I guess the idea is that learning a second language promotes cognitive development and growth.
Yeah.
Apparently this has been backed up by other studies referenced in the article. For example, this as anybody who's taught Japanese, or I assume students of other languages where they don't have such a distinction of the L and R phonemes that we have in English. Apparently, intensive study of those phonemes in students who can't traditionally make the difference shows different parts of the brain lighting up
right.
under scans. lighting up when the difference was understood and acquired.
Yeah. So maybe it's to do with the growth of like neural pathways and new ways of processing the sounds in the language. In which case it wouldn't be perhaps a mass growth, it wouldn't be a size growth of brain, but more of a density growth of brain. You see what I mean?
Yes, I imagine it's not, from the outside it wouldn't look like it was getting bigger. I don't know if that works.
So they clearly showed like an increase in brain size.
Bigness.
Yeah. So are there any kind of, can this go over to other areas of learning? So they're learning a language, so therefore their brain will focus on another activity.
Yeah, I mean, I guess it connects. I mean, for me, maybe this study is just getting a little bit more hard science behind effects that have been kind of recognized about language learning for a while.
Yeah.
Things like, I think there are studies about how language learning staves off Alzheimer's or dementia, those kind of things.
But that's why I was asking about the neuronal growth, because obviously Alzheimer's is to do with those pathways sort of dying off. But if you're doing an activity which habitually causes those pathways to be created, then you can imagine it would relate to a decrease or a decreasing effect of those illnesses. I think. Yeah.
So I think it's maybe just a bit of hard science behind the recognized benefits of language learning. Do you think this could be a way of selling English courses?
what the medical benefits of English?
Yeah,
perhaps. But I also think like more studies like this are kind of needed in this field.
I mean, how many people were there in the study? Do we know?
We don't know. No.
Okay.
I think there needs to be more scientific evidence behind some of the things that some people say.
Yeah, and what were the languages again?
Arabic, Russian, and Dari.
Right.
Okay.
And so, I mean, those are quite far away from the learner's first languages. And it'd be interesting to see comparative studies against, with other languages. So, like European languages, which are very close, obviously, to English, and then languages which are even further away, or even tonal languages, things like that, languages with different phoneme systems, and you can have like agglutinative languages.
This has a different writing system, so perhaps maybe that has some effect on the learning.
We've all studied foreign languages. Do you, beyond the obvious effects, do you feel any other benefits?
I can feel when I've been studying Japanese for a couple of hours, my brain hurts.
That's because it's growing.
That's because it's growing.
The skull's too small.
The cranium is opening up.
I mean, we're all sort of a bit too young to notice the effects. I think it'd be interesting to see when we're like, if you took us as a control group and put us against our friends who perhaps haven't learned languages, or people from the same age group and the same social group, and checked whether there was any growth, or the growth of brain, whether we had different levels of Alzheimer's.
I also wonder if there's a difference between acquired bilingualism and native bilingualism.
Well, that's what we were asking about before, about the brain place.
Right. Yeah. So where those things are stored in the brain, but also maybe acquiring a second language is more beneficial. I wonder. 'Cause there are obviously a lot of studies about how native bilingualism, people raised bilingual have certain benefits. They find it easier to learn another language, for example.
Yeah.
Do you think this can be something that could be sold to our students? Say you don't need English in your life, so you might not need it for your job, but this can make your brain bigger. Do you think that's something that?
I mean, you could probably sell it as like a therapy treatment, a rehabilitation treatment. That'd be quite interesting.
So it has some applications other than for learners. But
well, I mean, technically, but I guess
like people suffering from aphasia, or
that kind of thing.
So instead of trying to relearn their first language, learn a second language first. You don't need English anyway.
Yeah.
Some Dari.
Well, I've heard stories of people who got into accidents and just woke up speaking a second language. I mean, they weren't true, but I have heard them.
Yes.
Yeah. And how long was this study carried out for? Because the first study that you talked about, I think, was quite a long term one. It was like 40 years or something.
Yeah.
However long, it was a long time.
Yeah.
How about this one?
I don't know. I'm not sure the length, but presumably long enough that some change could be seen.
Yeah.
I mean, if it was a week, you assume it's not going to be huge changes.
Well, I was wondering if it was just like a few months, would how long lasting are these effects? Are they permanent, or if the person doesn't retain the language, or if they stop, then do the effects go away, or is it something you have to constantly keep doing?
Presumably, yeah.
I'd also like to know if this is just pure language input, and they're just I'd like to know what method was used to teach this language, perhaps, and if they automatised any of it at all, or if there was just mass input and their brain took on all this new information. Because that would make sense, that you'd be learning more, I guess. It'd be expanding in some way.
Well, possibly. I think it's probably the repetitive nature of it as well, because we kind of know from psychology that that if you repeat actions, then you forge new neural pathways, which is how you remember them. It's how you get like a muscle memory, right? So you'd think if they're learning a language in a very kind of structured, repetitive way, and they keep learning, they keep using the forms over and over again, then that would probably have more of an effect than if they're just having a massive language pushed on them without any structure to it.
Yeah.
That'd be just be my assumption.
But it's interesting because we also know that language acquisition doesn't work that way either.
Yeah.
So they could repeat whatever forms they memorized, but they wouldn't put them in a communicative situation, and they probably won't cope so well.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah. Well,
more brain studies needed, I guess.
Yeah. Would you be willing to volunteer your brain for medical science?
Certainly. Yeah. I don't use it for much, so.
I mean, if it was free language learning involved, get your brain checked.
Yeah. You'd have to learn Dari, and you'd have to go to Afghanistan to use it. But
stay in Japan.
Okay, that's today's news segment.
TEFL Cultures. For today's TEFL Culture, we're going to be talking about diplomas versus master's degrees. This is actually the first time that we've addressed one of the topics raised in the theme tune of the song. So,
is it?
Yes, it is.
We talked about dogma once.
A bit. But we didn't answer the question about dogma.
Okay, well, we'll get to that.
So, let's first think about the background a little bit. In the UK and Europe, and in North America, there are slightly different systems for entering TESOL generally, I think.
Yeah.
So in the UK, usually the progression is a certificate, for example, the CELTA or the Trinity Cert TESOL, and then a diploma, for example, the Delta or the Trinity Dip TESOL. And then for people who are really into it, they do a master's degree, usually in applied linguistics or TESOL. In North America, the pre-service master's degree is a lot more common. So people do the master's degree as an entry requirement into the teaching profession. What do you think about the two of those?
I think they've come about naturally, just from circumstance. Obviously, in the UK, there's a continent right there full of places where you can go and teach English as a foreign language. And lots of people wanting to go to, Spain or Italy or Poland for 6 months and do it. So that basic certification, the CELTA or the Trinity, makes a lot of sense.
And maybe it started out with the International House certificate as well. It has its roots in there, perhaps.
Well, I think the qualification probably comes from that, but I guess that the qualification itself is influenced by the model, which has been around for even longer than that, from when Berlitz had his school chain. This is a long-standing argument on our podcast. John Haycraft versus Berlitz.
Guan all the way from me.
I think it's interesting because now we teach in a context with lots of North American teachers, lots of British, Australian, New Zealand teachers, and so on. Do you see any difference between the types of teachers that emerge from the two different qualification systems?
I don't know. I perhaps I see a difference maybe just between teachers who got their MAs after having taught for a while and those who got their MAs pre-service.
Right. What difference would that be?
I mean, maybe the obvious ones, but the more experienced teachers obviously bring maybe a better awareness of basic classroom management skills, those kind of things.
Yeah.
having said that, I don't know, a lot of the North American teachers with pre-service MAs, maybe that kind of thing attracts more the people who just have more of a desire to be teachers.
Yeah.
And so also have a kind of ease in the classroom.
Yeah.
I suspect.
See, for me, it's always been you teach for like maybe even 5 years, maybe even more, and then you apply that to an MA to better your academic knowledge of teaching, not the other way around, like where you get an MA to teach or before you go into teaching. That seems counterintuitive.
Yeah, well, I think there's a difference between the types of MA that people take.
That's the question.
Yeah, because like in the UK, MAs are generally very theoretical. There's lots of courses on things like second language acquisition and stuff like that, but there isn't usually much assessed teaching practice.
No.
Whereas in the North American MAs, there does, not always, but much more often, there tends to be assessed teaching practice as part of the course. So you have to be doing that, or you have to do that in order to pass the course. So I guess you kind of get both sides of it, whereas through the European system, there's more of a progression from very basic classroom practice to more advanced classroom practice, to learning all the theory to back it up. Yeah. So the three of us have all got experience of doing diplomas and master's degrees. Which do you think has been more useful in terms of your professional development? Because for me, I actually did them both at the same time, and I really enjoyed the master's degree. I learned a lot from it, mainly about things like world Englishes and sociolinguistics and that kind of thing. In terms of my teaching, I don't know that it made a huge difference. It made a lot of difference in terms of my knowledge, my awareness, and things like that, and that's all really useful, and it's all things that I can apply to my work. But in terms of actually being in the classroom and doing classroom practice, I feel that the diploma, I did the Trinity diploma, I feel that was more useful in that sense.
Yeah, that makes sense. I certainly, in terms of like basic day-to-day classroom stuff, I think maybe the Delta was more useful for me. I mean, being in the Delta, being observed by whatever they call it, my local assessor.
Regional tutor, is that right?
Something like that, yeah. I don't remember. I did the distance Delta, but I was in London at the time, and so I had somebody from my age was my... I remember some of the people who I was doing the course with, one guy was in Burma, and he had to pay somebody to fly from Korea or somewhere to come and observe him and that kind of stuff. But luckily I was just down the road from International House. But, I remember the feedback I'd get from my observed lessons. It was very, very detailed, things about, when I was walking around the classroom, checking students' work. The first time the usual U-shaped classroom, but I was walking on the inside of the U, and then he just said, walk on the outside of the U, you become less of a presence. And just like very, very basic practical stuff like that, which I guess isn't necessarily always part of a Delta, but there were a lot of those little things. Having said that, my MA was very practical. It was kind of action research based.
Your MA was in Japan, right?
Yeah.
Right. Okay.
And so, and there were also a lot of practical things that came out of my MA.
So do you think your MA doesn't fit into either of these models? Do you think it's something different? If it was one in Japan, then what was it more like? If it was like one of these models?
Yeah, I mean, I don't really know either of those models very well, to be honest. There was certainly a lot of theory involved, but it was also, like I said, it was action research based. So once a month I had to present kind of update on my action research.
Okay.
So what I was doing in the classroom. It was only for in-service teachers.
Okay.
Yeah. So for my MA, I did it distance learning.
Yeah, me too.
And basically, like, I guess because I've been a teacher, I've been living in Japan and teaching in Japan, my MA was purely based on my experiences in the classroom, and I was applying that to what I had to do for my MA modules. And I was then reading more around the field, basically. So I was using my experience. So that's kind of the other way to what, say, someone who did a pre-service MA would do, where they'd be finding out a lot about the field and then maybe taking it into their job. And so that was the main differences. But with my certainly with my not my Delta. What did I do?
You did the Trinity. You did the same as me.
Yeah, right. We did the same. Yeah.
Clearly made a big impact.
Yeah. No, I learnt a lot, especially with defending the things you did in the class. You were interviewed immediately after you finished the class. talk about your class, how did it go, and you be very critical of yourself in the lesson and why were you doing the things that you did in the class.
Yeah.
But also, like, the thing that it taught me was catering more to the learners. Like, they had this whole thing about learner styles, thinking about how you'd adapt materials for particular learners in the room.
Which is, I've said before, I don't particularly like that. And this is maybe one of my criticisms of the diploma courses, and I don't know if it's the same on the Delta because I haven't done it. But on the Trinity, there were a lot of expectations of things that you were supposed to do in the classroom. And since getting the qualification, I've changed my mind on a lot of those. I don't think learning styles are particularly important. I mean, people enjoying learning in certain ways, I think that's important, but I don't think the learning styles as they're prescribed, I don't necessarily think that they're a real thing. I think, maybe preferences would be a better way to put it. But do you think that that's a problem with diplomas in that they do prescribe quite a clear way of teaching a lot of the time, whereas MAs give you a lot more freedom to experiment and so on?
I think so. I mean, I was always told on my Delta that, if I've met the lesson aims, then it would pass as a lesson.
Right.
And that you don't necessarily have to follow the lesson plan as you've laid it out beforehand.
Yeah.
Again, having said that, I still feel that there was, like you said, there was like a checklist of things that have to be done in a lesson to be called a successful lesson. And I agree with you. Maybe not all of those things are necessary for a successful lesson.
Right. Yeah, I think it's an interesting question. I think a lot of people, especially now, the master's degrees are becoming, I think, more popular these days. Especially because you can use them to get jobs in places like Asia and the Middle East, like much more high-paying jobs. And so I think it's interesting to discuss these topics. Because I think a lot of people are wondering, which one should I be doing? Should I be going for the more practical diploma or the master's degree? Or
I also think there's a problem within the recruitment as well. Like, maybe I'll just talk about Japan, but they have this kind of catch-all, you must have an MA or equivalent, or something in the area of TESOL or equivalent. And I'm not sure the actual people recruiting know the differences. They just kind of think, MA means this, but it means two different things, or three different things, or many different things, like we've found out. But they never seem to value deltas, for example. And it's just kind of just under the radar.
Yeah, I think that's because there's not that much awareness of it, and I think that's probably because in a country like Japan, they're following the American system.
Right.
But whereas in Europe, if you have a master's degree, it doesn't count for that much for the most part, especially for like jobs in the British Council. If you've got a UK master's degree without teaching practice, then you can't get the job with a master's degree if you don't have a certificate or a diploma or something with assessed teaching. So I guess it depends on the context that you're working in. But
I remember when I first came to Japan, I had to use my Delta and try to convince people that it was an MA equivalent.
Yeah, because it's the same level on the national qualifications.
It is,
framework.
In the UK, right?
Yeah.
And so I'd print out that little page of the website and say, it is like an MA, but it's not called one. And then I was surprised, I'd see jobs which only asked for an MA, and then sometimes I'd see job postings say MA or CELTA.
Yeah.
And I think they really, really don't know what a CELTA is, because
Well, when I got a job at a university here once, I sent in. This was before I was doing my masters, but I hadn't finished it. But I did have my diploma and I had my CELTA. And I went. They accepted me onto the job without meeting me. They just read. It was a 1 day a week part-time job, and they read my CV. And when I met the professor who was in charge of me, in charge of my contract, the first thing she said was, "So I understand that you went to Cambridge University." I was like, "Yeah."
The piece of paper I have came from there, maybe.
I remember my Cambridge day.
How do you think this affects, because we're all from Britain, America, for example, Australia. How about Japanese teachers of English
or non-native
speakers of English? Like, how does this model apply to them?
Yeah, it's interesting because I do know people who've non-native speakers who've taken certificate courses and diploma courses and things like that. And there's no problem with them entering the courses, but they do find it more difficult to get jobs afterwards. From my understanding, from what I've read. But master's degrees, I think, tend to be more popular. Because they're seen as being a bit less maybe daunting even a lot of native speakers, I know, native speaking teachers, opt for the masters over the diploma because the masters seems like it's, you know, you write essays, you send them in, you don't have to be in front of the classroom being assessed by people.
Yeah. Huh, that's interesting.
I think the problem is like universities are places of like thought of as places of being like academia, so that if you have an MA, you're somehow going to impart academic knowledge.
Yeah.
But with the Delta, obviously, you're teaching a skill, and I don't think some people realise that, or
Yeah.
the recruiters tread the path between the two, or as teachers we tread the path between the two.
Well, I think it's trying to find that balance between the academic side of things and the practical side of things, and I guess because the diploma perhaps isn't as well known, people tend to opt for the MA, but yeah, they don't quite map onto each other. So I guess it depends ultimately on what kind of job you want to do, what kind of system you want to work in, where you want to work, and so on, and that'll be the deciding factor in whether you choose a master's degree or a diploma, I guess. Yeah.
So there needs to be more awareness for everybody, essentially.
Yeah, I think so. So that's that question sort of answered.
TEFL Pioneers.
For today's TEFL Pioneer, we actually have our first living pioneer.
Wow.
And it was someone that I went to his presentation a couple of weeks back at the second international symposium on native speakerism, of which you may or may not have heard 2 interviews conducted. If you haven't listened to that, you can find it below this, I imagine.
Yeah, it depends how they're listening to it.
Anyway, find it. So today's TEFL Pioneer is Nobuyuki Hino. Nobuyuki Hino is a professor at Osaka University in Japan. And the reason I chose him as my pioneer, even though he's probably not that well known, and he's still alive and he's still a practicing teacher, I'm going to explain why I think he's a TEFL pioneer. So just a little bit of background about him. He's the current president of the Japanese Association of Asian Languages.
Okay.
And he was once a research assistant to Jack Richards.
Of Richards and Rogers fame.
Richards and Rogers fame, yeah. So he was once a research assistant. I think he also may have briefly worked at the University of Hawaii too.
Oh, okay.
Which we know is quite a famous institution.
A lot of our colleagues graduated from there.
Yeah. And he's also author. He's written over 200 articles focusing around cross-cultural literacy and the teaching of English as an international language.
Nice.
So I'm going to talk about why I think he's a pioneer. So in the late 80s, he was a radio presenter, as well as being a teacher. He also had his own radio show. And the name of the show is English for Millions.
Okay.
Are you aware of this show?
I was at the presentation as well, so...
I know you were. Matt, are you?
No, I'm not.
Okay.
Yeah. I know I'm aware of other or more recent NHK radio shows for teaching English.
Right.
Yeah. But I think it's different from maybe this one.
So there's a lot now, and there wasn't so much back then. Maybe not on the TV. I mean, these days on the TV in Japan, there are a lot of learn English with them. And often the model is they'll have a native speaker. Yeah. They'll have the Japanese expert. Yeah. They'll have and I'm putting this in parentheses, perceived native speaker. Yeah. Giving the model, and then the Japanese academic talking about what he just said.
Yeah, explaining the grammar, pointing out the intonation.
Tends to be 98% Japanese.
Yeah.
Yeah, basically, yeah. But his radio show, English for the Millions, it was a talk show, and it was centred around him interviewing speakers of English from outside the inner circle countries. Yeah. So, for example, Singapore, Sri Lanka, Bangladesh. Yeah. The example that he used in the interview, I believe, was someone from a Middle Eastern country. Could be Afghanistan. Right. So it kind of followed a talk show format where he'd interview the speaker, who I think they were probably living in Japan at the time, and they talk about maybe cultural topics such as religion, and different customs. Yeah. And at the time, I felt this was quite groundbreaking because it was in the late 80s, and Japan in the late 80s was a very different place. Obviously, it had the bubble economy, the bubble era. Yeah. The industry, the English teaching industry itself was focused around the what we call in Japan eikaiwa industry, which was
which means English conversation.
with usually or maybe 99% native speakers from America, Canada. So I found this interesting that he was giving an audience for speakers of world Englishes at the time. And I think in the 80s this was quite groundbreaking, because obviously this came before Jennifer Jenkins's breakthrough, perhaps, book of the Lingua Franca Core and English as an International Language.
Yeah. I mean, a lot of people have addressed the kind of the non-native speaker thing and the world Englishes thing for quite a long time, for a number of years. But it's interesting that in a society, I guess, where everything was very focused, and still is to a large extent very focused on Western in inverted commas, native speakers in inverted commas, that he was bringing, non-native speakers on and speaking to them about their varieties of English, and I guess legitimising them to an extent. Yeah.
So I think Nobuyuki Hino, he feels that maybe Japanese English as a variety probably won't take off, but he sees it as his place to kind of bring other word varieties to his students in Japan. So what he did on this talk show was, he'd conduct his interviews in English, and if a word came up or if a particular pronunciation point from the other speaker came up, he'd try and incorporate that into his own speech. So they were kind of developing this kind of interlanguage.
Integrated his own speech while he was speaking to that person? Or more generally?
I think he more generally in particular. I think a lot of people are trying to write textbooks about an intercultural language or ways to be intercultural. So I think he was trying to present a framework for how to do that in his interviews.
Do you have any examples of language that he incorporated into his speaking system
during
the radio show?
Yeah, if I can remember correctly, he was talking about religion to a guy from Afghanistan, and there was a problem. There was a misunderstanding about, I think, the word God.
It was because obviously I was there as well. I think it was that he tried to arrange the interview for a certain time, and he said, "So, are you going to be there?" And the guy said, "What's the word? Inshallah." Yeah,
only God. Only God.
Yeah, only God.
God
Only God. Yeah. And so, but he actually said in English was maybe. And Nobuyuki Hino was saying that he was really confused whether yes or no.
Right.
Yeah.
So So obviously it was conducted in English, and he kind of saw this interplay between like negotiating meaning of cultures, not just the language itself, but the actual underlying meanings behind what people say. He wants to show that to the Japanese nation, essentially. So and that's why I kind of find him to be a pioneer, because this was probably at a time when people just thought white male is our teacher and he can speak English. He comes from those countries, and he was kind of saying, well, no, that's not the case, and here are lots of other speakers on a Japanese, the national broadcaster as well, which was quite groundbreaking.
Yeah. It's kind of amazing that was happening back then, but even still now, there's so many problems in Japan with English education being focused on native speakers, getting people from America and Canada and the UK, like us, to come and teach the language. It's amazing that he was doing that back then.
So obviously he's still teaching. He works at a university in Osaka University. I probably shouldn't mention it, but what he does on the day-to-day, he talks about what he does with his classes, and he said he goes in early in the morning and he collects live news that's happening at the time, or news that happened a couple of hours ago. He collects all the sources, but he makes sure that all of the news sources are from different countries, not just for example the Japan Times or CNN. He kind of uses Al Jazeera. He gave a list of different news sources. And what he does, he gets the students to compare the type of language that's being used, the perspectives that are introduced, and maybe any language varieties that are going on in the classroom. And he showed us an example of him doing this.
Was it? I think it was like China and one of the southeastern.
It was it was an island dispute.
Or was it maybe a border conflict? I'm not sure, like a sea border conflict. But he showed the same news being reported from the two different English news channels from the two different countries. So they both have English news programs, and showed how they framed it differently and how they spoke about it differently.
So he kind of made this claim that, in a sense, it's CLIL because they're learning content through English, through the language, but it's also EIL2, English as an International Language, and he came up with this term where he put the two together into one long word. I can't remember what it was called. It was like Clelio or something like that.
Cleo.
Yeah. And he said that this model in itself is new. He coined this term actually. But he kind of sees that there should be this duality between the two, that they're learning content, but they should also be learning international awareness through the English language. But the English language in itself doesn't just belong to native speakers, and there's all these other varieties that we should be aware of. That's kind of what he's saying, basically. So what do you think of him then?
I mean, I agree. I think it sounds very groundbreaking, this idea of exposing language learners or anybody interested in English to different varieties of English, non-native varieties. Maybe one thing I was wondering is if he provided a lot of examples of Japanese people speaking English.
He showed us his students in the class, but the lesson that he showed us itself was very teacher-fronted. It was in a call room, actually, a computer.
Because they were watching the videos.
They were watching videos, so he had to be kind of picking on students kind of thing. But he did also show some videos of discussions that he did. He does these extracurricular discussion classes where he has Japanese students in the room, but he also makes sure that he has maybe half the group of international students. And he they're talking about a topic, maybe a topic related to Japan or the world, and he makes sure to get everybody's view, and I think that's how he's kind of developing this idea.
That's nice. I like the idea of showing Japanese English learners, for example, examples of successful Japanese users of English. If that makes sense.
I think it'd be interesting to see if this could be transferred into other contexts, or if it's necessary for it to be transferred into other contexts, because obviously this is taking place in Japan. Other countries perhaps have slightly more awareness of world English. It's obviously not all of the countries, but there's some countries that would have slightly more awareness. And I wonder if this kind of thing is being tried in any other context. I don't know about any others,
and I think you mentioned before about this in Japan, how the model teacher is still a Western host. But I think that's true in many countries. I don't think that's specific to Japan.
What I find slightly problematic is because he introduced, or not just him, but a lot of people are introducing this framework of how to be. I think Enrique in his interview talked about the teacher as being one who's what was it, bicultural. That idea, but actually enacting it in a language system is being proven to be quite difficult. Basically. That's some of my problems with it.
But I think it's interesting, and I think he sounds like a true pioneer.
He is, so that's our first living TEFL pioneer, Mr. Nobuyuki Hino.
Thank you for listening to this episode of TEFLology. As usual, if you have any questions or any comments, feel free to email us at teflology@gmail.com, and please rate the podcast or leave a review on iTunes or whatever media platform you choose to download or listen to this from. So it's goodbye from me.
It's goodbye from me.
Goodbye.